Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to be talking about what is CSS Grid. Now, maybe you've heard people talk about CSS Grid and thought, I can't use it yet, it's too futuristic. Well, we're going to be talking about the sort of compatibility. Can you use it? Should I learn it now? Should I learn it next year? What should I do about CSS Grid? I'm not going to get so much into how to use CSS Grid, but I'm going to give you some learning resources so you can learn the history of CSS Grid, the syntax of CSS Grid, and some practical ways that you can learn CSS Grid. So again, we're going to be talking all things what it is, when you should use it, how you should learn it, that sort of stuff right now. Okay, so in this What Is Wednesday, I wanted to do something pretty topical here, considering the Modern CSS Layouts course was just released yesterday for Level Up Tutorials, and in this course I teach CSS Grid along with Flexbox pretty extensively, where we go over sort of how to use Grid in practical layouts. Now, what exactly is CSS Grid? Because it's really easy to just think, okay, it's a basic grid. In fact, I made these sort of diagrams here to sort of talk a little bit about what grid is. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what exactly CSS Grid is. It's a new layout engine in CSS. Now, does Grid replace the need to use floats or flexbox or any of the stuff you used before? Well, in my opinion, it largely replaces the need to use any sort of float-based layout. However, those tools aren't going away, so it's just going to augment your skills in whatever you're doing. Basically, it's taking a new way of writing your CSS layouts and individual like macro and micro layouts and making everything a ton nicer. Now, I've seen in the comments before it referred to as, well, back to using tables for laying out your HTML. And that couldn't be any further from the truth. The CSS Grid is by no means HTML tables. And if you think that, then you're going to need to go ahead and reevaluate everything you know about CSS Grid. This is something that you're going to want to add to your tool belt absolutely right away. So whether it's through Level Up Tuts or some other means, you're going to want to learn CSS Grid, because before you know it, everyone in every layout on CSS will be done with CSS Grid. So let's talk a little bit about, well, the grid itself. This isn't going to be a tutorial on grid, but I want to go over some basic concepts here. So I've put together some diagrams to help illustrate some of these terms. You can see just a series of grid cells and sort of like boxes, right? And we have something like a grid line, and this is the lines in between your grid cells, right? Just like that. We have a grid cell itself. We have what's called a track, which is several grid cells which are placed in between two lines. Like a grid track can be both vertical and horizontal, right? This is a grid track. And then we have something like a grid area, where it's a section of your grid that takes up between four lines, right? It's basically just a section of your grid. And so with grid, you think of it as, like I mentioned before, people will criticize it as being a table layout or something stupid like that. But it's really so much more than that, because, well, we have total access to anything. This is gridbyexample.com/examples. And this is just a really good idea to check this out, to sort of open your brain as to what's even possible, if not a great learning resource for grid. But you can see you can have a really standard grid, or you can even place individual items wherever the heck you want them. And you can have items spanning multiple columns and multiple rows, and you can do all sorts of automatic positioning for all this stuff. Basically, the CSS Grid is the most flexible, most well thought out thing I've ever seen in CSS. It allows you to do just some absolutely amazing stuff with very little code. And the best part of all, it allows us to abandon things like clear fixes and floats and stuff like that. And not only that, but we get access to some properties that became available to us with Flexbox, like justify content. So if you have something that's display grid and there's some grid children, you can now quickly and easily just place something in the center of your div. And how long has that always been a thing? Like a question on Stack Overflow. How do I center this text in this div? Well, you can now do it extremely easily with CSS Grid. So like I said, CSS Grid by Example, or just gridbyexample.com, is a great way where you can see some really complex grid examples, but also just wrap your head around the idea of what is possible with CSS Grid. Because seriously, anything is possible with CSS Grid. I've even gone ahead in my Modern CSS Layouts course. I've recreated scotttolinsky.com here using CSS Grid, where typically in the past you'd have this video that's positioned absolutely in the background here. And now I can do this all with CSS Grid, having this be a grid row, this be a grid row, this be a grid row, and the background itself be its own grid row. And it's not using position absolute at all. And you get some nice things like a free sticky footer and stuff like that out of it. So, like I said, CSS Grid is just absolutely flexible and insanely useful, and it just blows your mind, all of the cool stuff you could do. Again, this is not table layouts. So let's talk a little bit about some of the cool things that you can do in my Modern CSS Layouts course. I'm not trying to make this an advertisement, but you can see here we actually recreate the TweetDeck layout, where it allows you to infinitely span columns, right? If we were to add more columns, this would work. If we were to add more tweets, this would scroll, and everything is done without position absolute, without position fixed. This is all a CSS Grid. And I'm using the Firefox Dev Tools here, which is absolutely essential if you are working with CSS Grid. In the developers edition of Firefox, there's a little layout tab. You can click this and see your grid down here, or let me even pull this up. You can even get a diagram of your grid and hover over the different grid cells. It's super cool stuff. So these tools only make your life infinitely easier when working with Grid. Now let's talk about compatibility, because obviously that is something that is on everyone's mind, and we're seeing a ton of green here. I mean, it's been in Chrome since version 60, it's been in Firefox since version 52, it's in Microsoft Edge, and it has limited support in IE 11, and you could check out exactly what that limited support is. Now, it's got a big old red from Opera Mini, UC browser for Android, Samsung browser for Android, although I think it's coming in the next version of Samsung. I'm not entirely positive about that. But as you can see here, some of this red doesn't really matter, because how many times does your grid or your layout break down into a single column on mobile? So that's something to think about, right? Because if the browser doesn't understand grid, it's just going to break down. So maybe if your Samsung internet browser is just going one column, it's not that big of a deal. This is obviously something you want to make sure is good for your customers. Now, I am using CSS Grid on leveluptutorials.com right now. In fact, if I head to the store section, this right here is a CSS Grid. And we can even inspect this. If you have Firefox DevTools open, you can inspect it, click on layout, we can check this checkbox and see my grid, my even spacing between all of my different grid tracks and stuff like that. Everything is looking super cool. So this is CSS Grid, and here it is being used in live production code. So check your Can I Use list, make sure you know what your audience is using before you go ahead and use this. My opinion is whether or not you're using this on client sites right now or not, you need to be using this in all of your personal projects or code pens or stuff you're messing around with, because it is absolutely going to be vital to know CSS Grid moving forward. Again, if you think this is HTML table layouts, you are going to get left behind. And of course, in this industry, it sucks to get left behind, because it's hard to get back in the swing of things, because there's just too much to learn. So CSS Grid is something you need to focus your attention on, and I emphasize that very strongly. If you want to learn more about CSS Grid, there's a dope syntax episode for CSS Grid. Syntax.fm, if you do not know, is the podcast I do with Wes Boss, where Wes Boss and I we just talk about web dev stuff, and episode 18 is all about CSS Grid. We talk about all sorts of great learning resources. We talk about different techniques and examples. It's a really good episode, especially if you're interested in this stuff and you haven't yet checked out Syntax. So syntax.fm, episode number 18. I'll link this in the description as well. Now, another good thing to do is read this A List Apart, the story of CSS Grid from its creators. This gives you a long and detailed history about everyone involved in CSS Grid, and basically how CSS Grid has been essentially a part of CSS for a very long time, and in terms of people wanting to get it added and different layout specs that have been attempted to be added to CSS, and how we finally got it right in what I consider the most flexible, most excellent edition of CSS in a very, very long time. Okay, so check out this list apart, the story of CSS Grid from its creators. Great article, one of the best I've read. Again, syntax episode 18. And if you want to learn CSS Grid, you can always go to this gridbyexample.com/examples if you're the type of person who learns better by checking out examples. And if you want a video to teach you, I mean, why not promote my own here? We have leveluptutorials.com/store. The Modern CSS Layouts course is on sale. It just came out yesterday. It's 17 long videos. There's some 17 minutes long, and just absolutely great stuff. You get all of the code examples, and I teach you how to build several different layouts. So we build scotttolinsky.com, we build TweetDeck, we build Facebook, and we build Instagram, and each of those examples teaches you a little bit more about CSS Grid, as well as when to use Flexbox versus when to use Grid in different types of situations. So this is CSS Grid. Like I said, it is going to replace everything you know and love about layouts in CSS, and you will absolutely love it once you get going using it. So as always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.